At 7:10 on the morning of June 4, 1942, First Lieutenant James Murray pushed his B-26 Marauder down to 200 feet above the Pacific, watching 30 Japanese Zero fighters peel out of the sun and dive toward him from 12,000 feet. Murray was 23 years old. It was his first combat mission, and nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what was about to happen. 150 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled in the Pacific. Four fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, steamed in tight formation, screened by 11 destroyers, 2 battleships, and 3 heavy cruisers. Between them, those carriers carried nearly 300 aircraft and more than 12,000 sailors. 6 months earlier, these same ships had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, for American B-26 Marauders were flying straight at them. The Martin B-26 had never been meant for this mission. It was a fast medium bomber with small wings, enormous engines, and brutal handling characteristics. Its landing speed was over 150 miles per hour. Its wing loading was so high that pilots joked it flew only because it was afraid to stop. Early accident rates were so severe that crews had given it a nickname no one in the Martin factory liked to hear: the Widowmaker. No one at Wright Field had ever imagined hanging a 2,000-pound torpedo beneath a Marauder's belly. No one had trained B-26 crews to fly torpedo attacks at wave-top height while facing the full weight of Japanese naval anti-aircraft fire. And no one had briefed Murray's squadron on torpedo tactics before they were scrambled off Midway's Coral runway shortly after 6 o'clock that morning. For aircraft took off. Captain James Collins led the formation. Murray flew second, in an aircraft named Suzie Q, after the nickname of his wife, Alice. 2 of the 4 crews had never dropped a live torpedo. The other 2 had dropped exactly 1 practice torpedo each. Between all 4 aircraft, the total combat experience amounted to 0 missions and roughly 90 minutes of torpedo training. 2 of those Marauders would never return. The crews understood the mathematics before they climbed aboard. 3 hours earlier, Navy torpedo squadrons attacking the same Japanese fleet had lost 45 aircraft out of 51 launched. 225 men were dead. Most of them had been shot down in the first 8 minutes. The B-26 carried a 7-man crew. Murray's co-pilot was 2nd Lieutenant Prenmore. His bombardier was 2nd Lieutenant Russell Johnson. Staff Sergeant John Gogoe manned the dorsal turret. Corporal Frank Mello worked the waist gun. Private Earl Ashley covered the tail. Navigator William Moore kept them on course toward Nagumo's fleet. At 7 o'clock, they found the carriers. For enormous flat tops cut white wakes through the sea, their flight decks already busy with aircraft being fueled and rearmed. Even from a distance, the scale of the force was unmistakable. 30 Zero fighters rose to meet 4 American bombers. The mathematics were not complicated. Captain Collins banked hard left ahead of Murray. Tracer fire slashed past Suzie Q's cockpit. Murray dropped lower. 150 feet. 100 feet. 50 feet above the waves. The Marauder's propellers threw salt spray across the windscreen as Navigator Moore called out the range. 3,000 yards. 2,000. 1,500. Akagi's anti-aircraft guns opened fire. 25mm shells burst ahead of the formation in thick black puffs. Heavier shells from the destroyer screen joined in, tearing the air apart with concussive blasts. The sky filled with smoke, steel, and tracer lines converging on 4 aircraft that had no right to be there. Murray held course. Zeros attacked from above and behind. Gogoe's dorsal turret hammered back, the vibration shaking the entire airframe. At 1,000 yards, Moore shouted the release point. 5 seconds. 4. 3. Murray's hands locked on the yoke. Cannon rounds punched through the fuselage. Something exploded behind the cockpit. Smoke poured from the radio compartment. Torpedo away. Johnson released at 800 yards. Suzie Q leapt upward as 2,000 pounds fell free. Murray banked right to clear Akagi's path. And then every gun on the flagship locked onto him. Shells tore through wings, tail, and engines. Tracers converged from every angle. Murray understood, with sudden clarity, that he had 10 seconds, perhaps less, to live. So he did the last thing the Japanese gunners expected. He turned toward the carrier. Murray shoved the yoke forward. The Marauder screamed across the water at 280 miles per hour. 50 feet. 40. 30. Akagi's bow rose ahead like a steel cliff. 860 feet long, 102 feet wide, packed with aircraft wingtip to wingtip. Japanese sailors saw the bomber coming straight at them. Some dropped flat. Others kept firing. Muri did not flinch. At 15 feet, he pulled back. Suzie Q cleared Akagi's bow by less than 6 feet. The B-26 thundered down the length of the flight deck at masthead height. Prop wash knocked men off their feet. Zero fighters rocked on their landing gear. Anti-aircraft crews abandoned their guns. On Akagi's bridge, Vice Admiral Nagumo watched an American bomber pass 20 feet in front of him at nearly 300 miles per hour. The blast shattered windows. Staff officers hit the deck. Nagumo did not. In the nose, Russell Johnson grabbed the gun and fired. 50 caliber rounds raked the flight deck from bow to stern. An anti-aircraft position disintegrated. Sailors fell. Shell casings poured across the windscreen. Inside the fuselage, Frank Mello fought a fire with one hand and fired his gun with the other. Hydraulic fluid sprayed everywhere. Instruments went dark. Prenmore crawled aft through smoke, dragging a first aid kit to wounded gunners. 3 men were hit. 1 badly. In 3 seconds, the entire flight deck vanished behind them. Muri dropped back to wavetop height. No ship could fire without risking its own flagship. Suzie Q disappeared into smoke, fire, and confusion. When Muri banked right, both engines were failing. Oil pressure bled away. Temperatures spiked. Zero fighters swarmed behind him. Then, without warning, they broke off. All 30. Muri did not know that American dive bombers were at that very moment rolling in from 20,000 feet above Nagumo's fleet. He only knew that Suzie Q was still flying. Barely. Prenmore crawled back into the cockpit with blood soaking his flight suit. None of it was his. He had spent the last several minutes moving through a fuselage filled with smoke and fire, bandaging wounded gunners while the aircraft shuddered from structural damage and violent evasive maneuvers. Ashley was stable. Gogoi was stable. Frank Mello, his face cut and bleeding from flying metal, refused to leave his gun. Moore dropped into the co-pilot's seat and scanned the instruments. He said nothing. Neither man needed words. They both understood the mathematics. 150 miles to Midway. Fuel for perhaps 200 miles, if the tanks weren't leaking. 1 engine failing. Hydraulics destroyed. No radio. No way to warn the airfield. For 20 minutes, Suzie Q flew in loose formation with Captain James Collins's Marauder. Collins's aircraft began to fall behind, smoke thickening, altitude sagging. Muri held his speed. Every pilot knew the rule. You can't save a damaged aircraft by damaging your own. Collins lifted a hand from his cockpit and waved. Muri waved back. Then the 2 bombers separated, each continuing alone. Far behind them, aboard Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge and made the decision that would lose Japan the Pacific War. The American attacks, torpedo bombers, high-altitude B-17s, and the suicidal B-26 run had achieved almost nothing tactically. No ships sunk. No decisive hits. But they came in waves. Nagumo concluded that Midway's air defenses remained strong. His carriers still held aircraft armed with torpedoes for attacking American ships. He ordered them rearmed with bombs to strike the island again. Deck crews began the changeover. Torpedoes were hauled down. Bombs were brought up. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks. The process would take 90 minutes. At 7:40, a scout plane radioed a single message. Enemy carriers sighted. In one transmission, the entire battle turned upside down. Nagumo ordered another changeover, back to torpedoes. Crews scrambled to undo everything they had just done. Aircraft now surrounded by stacked bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines. The decks of Japan's carriers became floating tinderboxes. Muri knew none of this. He flew across empty ocean, watching the right engine die inch by inch. Oil pressure slid to 0. Temperature climbed past redline. Inside the Pratt & Whitney R-2800, metal components began to seize and weld together under heat and friction. The engine could fail at any moment. 50 miles from Midway, smoke appeared on the horizon. Japanese strike aircraft returning from their attack. 24 bombers and fighters crossed paths with Suzie Q. Several fighters broke away and turned toward the crippled Marauder. Muri pushed the left engine to maximum power. The single radial screamed. Coolant temperature spiked. The B-26 surged to 280 miles per hour on one engine and determination. The Japanese fighters fell behind. They were low on fuel. They could not chase a damaged bomber all the way back to Midway. At 20 miles, the right engine finally quit. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Muri feathered it. Now Suzie Q flew on one engine alone. Altitude bled away. 50 feet. 30. 10 miles out, Midway appeared through the haze, a strip of coral and sand in the middle of nowhere. The runway was 6,500 feet long. Plenty for a healthy B-26. Maybe not enough for this one. The hydraulics were gone. Normal gear extension was impossible. Manual gear extension required 2 men and time they barely had. And then Moore reported one more problem. The left main landing tire was gone. Shot away over Akagi's flight deck. The wheel rim remained. The rubber was gone. Landing on a bare rim meant the aircraft would pull violently left on touchdown. 5 miles out. Altitude, 30 feet. Single engine screaming. Moore began cranking the manual gear handle. The mechanism resisted. Something in the linkage was bent. He kept cranking. Normal extension required 40 full rotations. With battle damage, it took nearly double. 3 miles out, the main gear locked. The nose wheel refused to move. Moore cranked harder. His hands bled. The handle jammed. Landing without a nose wheel meant a forward pitch, prop strike, and likely breakup. 2 miles out. Muri held 20 feet of altitude, engine far beyond safe limits. 1 mile out. The nose wheel dropped. Locked. All 3 wheels were down. 1 tire missing, but they were down. Midway's runway rushed toward them. Speed, 190 miles per hour, too fast. But slowing meant stalling. Muri crossed the beach at 15 feet, then chopped the throttle. The B-26 fell like a brick. 160, 150, 140. Suzie Q hit the runway at 135 miles per hour. Right main gear first. Then the left rim struck coral. Sparks exploded. The aircraft yanked left. Muri stomped right rudder. The nose slammed down. Prop tips shattered against the runway. Metal fragments flew. The brakes used the last remaining hydraulic pressure. Speed bled away. 100, 80, 60. Wreckage blocked the far end of the runway. Muri aimed for a gap. Suzie Q rolled to a stop with 800 feet remaining. Fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the aircraft. Muri shut down the engine. Silence crashed in. His hands shook on the yoke. Behind him, 3 wounded men waited. Medics climbed aboard. An intelligence officer tapped on the cockpit. Muri stepped onto Midway's coral runway and began counting bullet holes. He stopped at 200. The ground crew chief finished the count. 506 impacts. The assessment was simple. Suzie Q would never fly again. Captain Collins landed 30 minutes later. His aircraft was just as ruined. The other 2 Marauders never returned. Lieutenant Herbert Mays and Lieutenant William Moore went into the Pacific with their crews. Muri looked back at his aircraft, shot through, burned, broken, and only then allowed himself to understand what they had survived. For B-26 Marauders attacked Nagumo's carriers that morning. 2 came back. 2 did not. 14 men died. No survivors. No wreckage recovered. The ocean took them and kept them. By every tactical measure, the mission was a failure. No torpedo hits. No visible damage to a Japanese ship. 2 aircraft written off, crews shredded, and the survivors lucky to be standing. Lieutenant James Muri sat on Midway's coral runway and watched ground crews swarm over Suzie Q like forensic investigators. They photographed everything, measured everything, logged everything for intelligence, because the airplane itself was now evidence. The wings were peppered with cannon holes. The fuselage looked stitched with machine gun fire. The tail section was so riddled it barely resembled an aircraft component. Both engines were ruined internally, even though they had run long enough to drag 7 men home. It was a flying miracle, one that would never fly again. A maintenance officer approached Muri with a quiet permission. If the crew wanted it, they could cut the name off the fuselage before the airplane was scrapped. It took an hour. 10 snips. Careful hands. Slow, deliberate cuts. The nose art came away in one piece. Suzie Q, named for Alice Muri's nickname, became a jagged metal plate, the only part of the bomber anyone would keep. 2 days later, a bulldozer pushed the Marauder to the beach and shoved it into shallow water. Serial number 40 to 1391. 9 months old. One combat mission. 506 bullet holes. Gone. At first glance, the attack seemed meaningless. But the real impact of those B-26 was never going to be measured in torpedo hits. It was measured in what they did to the mind of Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo. Nagumo had stood on Akagi's bridge and watched an American bomber roar down the length of his flight deck at masthead height. So close the blast of its propellers knocked men flat and rattled the glass in the bridge. It was not just danger. It was insistence. Midway's aircraft weren't firing one desperate volley. They were coming in waves. B-26 with torpedoes, B-17s from altitude, Navy torpedo bombers slashing in low. None of them were scoring decisive hits, but the pattern told Nagumo something he could not ignore. Midway was still fighting. Midway was still dangerous. And if Midway was still dangerous, the island had to be hit again, harder. Nagumo ordered his strike aircraft, already armed with torpedoes for an anti-ship attack, to be rearmed with bombs for another strike on Midway's airfield. Deck crews started the changeover. Torpedoes were pulled and rolled aside. Bombs were hauled up. Fuel hoses ran across the hangar decks. Aircraft sat half-armed, half-fed, surrounded by ordnance like a powder magazine with wings. Then a scout plane's report arrived that detonated the plan in Nagumo's mind. American carriers sighted. The tactical world flipped in an instant. Nagumo reversed himself. Rearm with torpedoes again. Now, the deck crews scrambled, undoing what they had just done. Weapons piled beside weapons, fuel lines everywhere, aircraft trapped in the worst possible configuration, bombs, torpedoes, and gasoline stacked together under time pressure. This was the opening the Americans would exploit. Not long after, high above the fleet, the first SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared, dark specks becoming knives. They came down from altitude at terrifying speed, the dive brakes screaming, the angle so steep it looked like physics had given up. The Japanese fighters that should have been above them weren't there. They were low, scattered, and fuel-thin after chasing torpedo bombers and harassing attackers near the surface. The protective umbrella had collapsed downward, leaving the top of the sky open. On the carrier decks, men looked up and realized what was happening a heartbeat too late. A bomb struck and punched through the flight deck into the hangar below, where bombs sat beside torpedoes, where fuel lines ran, where aircraft waited, armed and exposed. The chain reaction wasn't dramatic. It was mechanical. It was chemistry and heat and momentum. Within minutes, fires became storms. Elevators became chimneys. Hangars became furnaces. A carrier force that had ruled the Pacific became a burning trap. And suddenly, what had looked like a pointless torpedo run, what had looked like suicidal noise, revealed its real value. It had helped shove Nagumo into the worst possible decision loop at the worst possible time. The earlier attacks had not sunk ships, but they had forced defensive maneuvers, forced fighter deployments downward, forced urgency onto the decks, forced rearming chaos into the hangars. And when the dive bombers arrived, chaos was exactly what they needed. Muri and his crew stayed on Midway as the battle finished around them, an island humming with wounded men, scorched metal, and the smell of burned aviation fuel. His gunners were treated, wounds cleaned, bandaged, sutured. Infection fought with whatever supplies existed on a coral outpost under threat. Muri wrote his after-action report the next day. Intelligence officers questioned him for hours. Altitudes, headings, fighter numbers, flak patterns, the exact moment he chose to pull toward Akagi instead of away. Muri answered everything, steady and precise. His hand still shook when he held the pencil. The decoration arrived later, the Distinguished Service Cross for Muri and his crew. The citation praised extraordinary heroism. It praised the torpedo run, the concentrated anti-aircraft fire, the fighter opposition, the refusal to break. It did not mention that the torpedo missed, because the point wasn't the torpedo. The point was what their attack represented, and what it helped create. A fleet under pressure, forced into fatal vulnerability, right before the dive bombers arrived. No historian can draw a perfect straight line from one bomber's flight over a carrier deck to 3 carriers burning later. But everyone who understands combat decision-making understands something else. You don't always win a battle by hitting the target. Sometimes you win by forcing the enemy into a rhythm of fear and urgency, until they make one decision too fast, and the war punishes them for it. After Midway, Muri was pulled from frontline duty. The Army needed experienced B-26 pilots alive to train others to handle the Widowmaker. He taught new crews approach speeds, engine-out procedures, emergency handling, how to survive when everything fails at once. He never flew another combat mission. One was enough. One torpedo run was enough. One pass over a carrier deck was enough for a lifetime. And decades later, when the Battle of Midway became legend, the headlines belonged to dive bombers and carriers and decisive hits. But the truth of that morning also belonged to the men who came in low, knowing the odds, flying anyway, creating the pressure and confusion that made the decisive strike possible. For B-26 went in. 2 never came back. And the Pacific War turned, partly because 14 men died in an attack that, on paper, achieved nothing. The B-26 attack on June 4, 1942 rarely appears in popular retellings of Midway. 4 Army bombers attacking a carrier task force did not fit the mythology of decisive naval aviation. 2 aircraft lost. No torpedo hits. Minimal visible damage. By tactical standards, it looked like failure. Yet historians kept returning to one detail. One moment. At 7:10, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of Akagi and watched an American bomber fly past his flagship at masthead height. An aircraft moving at nearly 280 miles per hour, covering the length of Akagi's 860-foot flight deck in 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Nagumo never forgot them. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized relentless offense. Strike first, strike hard, never relinquish initiative. Nagumo had built his career on that creed. Pearl Harbor had proven it correct. But on the morning of June 4th, American aircraft from Midway attacked his fleet in coordinated, persistent waves. B-26 with torpedoes. B-17s bombing from altitude. Navy torpedo squadrons charging through walls of fire. None achieved decisive hits, but together they demonstrated something far more dangerous than damage. Midway was still operational. Midway was still aggressive. Nagumo's standing orders from Admiral Yamamoto were clear. Keep his strike aircraft armed with torpedoes for the primary mission, destroying American carriers. Midway was secondary, but Nagumo had just watched an American bomber nearly collide with his bridge. He had seen torpedo tracks in the water. He had felt the proximity of attack. At 7:15, 5 minutes after James Muri cleared Akagi's stern, Nagumo ordered his aircraft rearmed with bombs for another strike on Midway. The decision was tactical and human. Deck crews began pulling torpedoes and hauling bombs from magazines below. Under ideal conditions, the process took 90 minutes. These conditions were anything but ideal. The fleet was under attack. Combat air patrol coordination was strained. Damage control teams were already fighting fires. At 7:40, the scout plane report arrived. American carriers sighted. Nagumo faced an impossible choice. Continue the Midway strike and leave his fleet vulnerable, or reverse the rearming process and lose critical time. He chose reversal. Torpedoes were brought back up. Bombs were stacked beside them. Fuel lines ran across crowded hangar decks. Every carrier now held explosive ordnance in the most dangerous configuration imaginable. At 10:20, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared overhead. They found Japanese carriers with cluttered decks, hangar bays packed with bombs and torpedoes, exhausted damage control teams, and fighter cover trapped low after chasing earlier attackers. The bombs that struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu detonated stacked ordnance. Torpedoes exploded. Fuel lines ruptured. Fire spread through multiple decks in minutes. Firefighting systems were overwhelmed. The damage was irreversible. Historians still debate whether Nagumo's rearming decision alone caused the catastrophe. Some argue the dive bombers would have succeeded regardless. Others contend that proper ordnance handling might have limited the destruction. But no serious historian disputes the psychological impact of the earlier attacks. Nagumo had watched an American bomber fly down his deck. That image influenced his thinking. That moment shaped his decisions. 3 seconds mattered. Muri never claimed his mission changed the battle. His after-action report was blunt. The torpedo missed. The attack achieved no direct hits. 2 aircraft were lost. He believed that until his death in 2013. The Air Force and Navy disagreed. His Distinguished Service Cross citation recognized extraordinary heroism under impossible conditions. In 2003, Muri received the Jimmy Doolittle Award for lifetime contributions to national security through aviation. At age 84, he attended the ceremony with his son. Alice had died 2 years earlier. Muri spoke briefly. He thanked his crew. He thanked the service. He named the 14 men who died in the other 2 B-26s and said they deserved recognition more than he did. Then he sat down and said nothing more about Midway. Muri died on February 3, 2013, in Laurel, Montana, aged 94. He was buried with full military honors. One artifact survived. The metal plate cut from the fuselage of Suzie Q, named for Alice Moyer Muri, whom James married on Christmas Day, 1941. The plate was donated to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in 2014. The paint has faded. Rust freckles the steel. The name remains visible. The wreck of B-26 Serial 40 to 1391 rests in 40 feet of water off Eastern Island, Midway Atoll. Coral grows over the wings. Fish shelter in the engine nacelles. The aircraft that flew through 506 bullet holes now serves as a reef. The men who flew that mission understood something historians took decades to articulate. Tactical failure and strategic success are not opposites. The torpedo missed. The mission achieved no immediate damage, but the chaos it created contributed to decisions that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers 90 minutes later. Wars are not won by single actions. They are won by accumulated moments. Muri flying over Akagi's deck was one. Torpedo squadrons dying in flames were others. High-altitude bombers, failed attacks, smoke, confusion, each mattered. 7 men flew into combat that morning. All 7 came home. They survived because a pilot made a split-second decision under impossible pressure. Because a co-pilot cranked landing gear by hand while the aircraft shook apart. Because wounded gunners kept firing. Because engineering and discipline held when luck ran out. The B-26 Marauder earned its Widowmaker reputation honestly. It punished mistakes and demanded perfection. But in the hands of pilots who respected its limits, it performed miracles. Suzie Q lost an engine. Lost hydraulics, lost most electrical systems, lost a tire, and still brought 7 men home across 150 miles of open ocean. That was not luck. That was engineering and courage under fire.